Hello, and welcome to the Heath and Havering URC Bible Study for the 7th of October, 2025. Our topic for this autumn series is Familiar Stories in a New Light, and today is the third session focused on Genesis chapters 15 through chapter 18, verse 15. Unfortunately, today we had some issues with our video quality when we recorded the session, but we have the audio for you. So I hope that you will listen in and enjoy today's Bible study session. All right. Why don't we go ahead and get started this morning? Our third of four studies in Genesis, and I'll remind you at the end, no session next week, then the following week. So why don't we start with a word of prayer? Loving God, we welcome you into our time today to guide our conversations and open up your word for us. Help us to take away the lessons that you have for each one of us and for our churches as well. It's in Jesus' name that we pray. Amen. Amen. So, anything in particular from last time we need to follow up on? We had a conversation about Jewish practices last week around saying the name of God. We talked about that a little bit, and I had suggested that I would take a look into it. It doesn't appear to be really clear cut, just on cursory notice. Given what transpired last week in Manchester and the anniversary of the attacks today and stuff, I don't want to really get into it too much. But in looking at Judaism, is like Christianity, has sort of some different divisions in it as far as as far as how they interpret the scripture.
Practices that they
Yeah. So you have the Orthodox and the ultra-Orthodox who tend to be more.
The Orthodox have the women and the men separated, isn't it?
Yeah. Well, and that where the different dress and all of that, and then there's also conservative Judaism, which really isn't conservative; it's more progressive. So that's kind of confusing. Reform Judaism, Reform and conservative Judaism. For example, the synagogue in the town where I come from is a Reformed conservative, but it's very progressive. So
it depends when it was reformed.
Well, that's probably true. So there's a lot of.
Was there just one in your town? Was there
No, there was
just one in one community.
Yeah, there was just one, and so anyway, so part of my thought when I commented about how they prayed was I'd attended worship at that synagogue a number of times and was always very impressed with the language in their prayer book. It was just really beautiful stuff. So I looked up their website to see if they had any resources, and several times they had stuff that talked about God, G-O-D, no dash, just, So some of the other resources I found online offered up examples of Jewish prayer, and the first one you would see might have a hyphen or a dash in the middle of the word, and then the next prayer, it would just be spelled out. So my memory was a lot of times God was referred to as the King of the universe. That often came up in the prayers in my limited experience with that. But anyway, so I can't give you any kind of definitive answer, but obviously very traditionally, and I suspect in the more Orthodox expressions of Judaism, there probably is much more of a concern about how they address or say the name of God.
And I'll also say in those prayers, a number of times, especially if they were Hebrew prayers in translation and they had the sort of, not alliteration, but the,
Annotation?
well, kind of had the Hebrew and then had sort of the syllables so you could pronounce along in Hebrew.
One's going from right to left, one's going from
Yeah,
left.
yeah. But a lot of times Adonai came up, and that was one of the names we talked about last week.
Do they
That
have
gets,
like a Bible with two texts, like you used to be able to get Latin or Greek?
yeah. I mean, I think again, it probably depends on where you're at, but yeah, there were would be certain sections where it'd be Hebrew on the left and the English or whatever the vernacular was on the right. So anyway.
Am I right in thinking they're not allowed to touch the print? Or is that just the scrolls when they bring the scroll down?
I think that's more the scrolls.
So they are allowed to have.
Yeah, because they have,
They can hold.
again, in the synagogue I've had most of my experience, well, a couple of them that I've been in, and you go in and they have pews or seats, set up much like our churches, and yeah, I mean, each one will have a prayer book and a song book.
There's a big ceremony about.
But is it the
bringing
Bible? Is it the Old Testament? That's what I'm asking.
That's a good question. I don't know.
There's always a big ceremony every time when they bring the scrolls in.
Yes.
And if they have to get out fast, evacuate, or they're deported, they take the scrolls with
Yes.
them. The scroll represents the church.
Yes.
Rather like the font in Christian churches, they'll move the font from one. They rebuild the church.
Yes.
You use the font from the previous.
Yeah.
The font's sort of the oldest thing in the church.
And I think oftentimes in they call them the ark is where they keep the scrolls, and I think oftentimes they'll have the set that they use in worship and everything, and often the retired scrolls, if they've replaced their scrolls over time, are also stored in there because they can't destroy them. So
they're like a leather case, aren't they? Like you keep it.
can be. I mean, they're usually in very elaborate coverings, and yeah. Well, and I mean, they're obviously sacred in nature because they are the Word of God, and they're also, I would have to imagine, incredibly expensive. They're handmade, and anyway. So if any of you have ever been in a synagogue or seen on TV, massive scrolls and all that. So anyway, I can't share much more than that, but wanted to follow up on that because that was one of the things that we were talking about. Okay, so today, chapter 15 through the beginning of chapter 18, and this is focusing more specifically on sort of the emerging covenant with Abram. So I wanted to start off with sharing a note in one of the commentaries that I read. This is Walter Brueggemann, who well-respected Old Testament scholar, and he's writing about Genesis 15, and he talks about how he thinks that chapter 15 is the most important and pivotal passage, in the Abraham story, which would make it a very important section, at large. And so I just want to read this paragraph from his commentary and just listen to the way that he frames this. This helped me think about what's going on in these chapters and relating it really to today in a lot of ways. But he writes this, It says, Abraham and Sarah were called out of their barrenness by God's powerful word. And he has some textual references in there to remind us that when we first meet Abram and Sarai at the end of chapter 11, this is before God calls them, it is noted, made very specific, that she is barren. So we know that before we even know why they're important. So Abraham and Sarah were called out of their barrenness by God's powerful word. Their pilgrimage of hope had begun on no other basis than the promise of Yahweh. The promise of Yahweh stood over against the barrenness. But when we arrive at chapter 15, the barrenness persists. And that barrenness, which the promise has not overcome, poses the issue for this chapter. The large question is that the promise does delay even to the point of doubt. It is part of the density of our common faith, part of the destiny of our common faith, that those who believe the promise and hope against barrenness nevertheless must live with the barrenness. Why and how does one continue to trust solely in the promise when the evidence against the promise is all around? That is the scandal that is faced here, and it's Abraham's embrace of this scandal that makes him the father of faith. Does that make sense to think about it in that way? And I think it takes the idea of her barrenness and removes it from being a specific condition of a specific person to being a larger, issue that, when God calls Abram from the first time, talks about making a nation of him, which would then imply that the barrenness is not going to be an obstacle. And we know, because we've heard the story before, that that does come true. But if you think about this long period of time between when Abraham has been following and responding to this call from God, with part of the expectation being that the barrenness problem is going to disappear, what is it that propels him to keep his faith? And I think that speaks probably to us, because it's we may not be dealing with literal barrenness, but I think the line in there about how do you persist in faith when everything around you seems contrary to it, and obviously he lifts that up as a quality of Abraham that then we should embrace as well. So that kind of helped me think about what's coming up in these chapters that we're going to look at today.
Maybe going off at a tangent a bit, but he's obviously monogamous, and that wasn't the practice. And if he was that anxious to get children, why didn't he have another wife?
Yeah.
Well,
The thing with his,
we'll see some of that today.
Yeah.
We had that story the last time about pretending he and Sarai were brother and sister, which isn't necessarily a polygamous thing, but would suggest kind of playing a little loose with how that agreement works. That is something to think about. So at the beginning of chapter 15, page conveniently 15 in your Bible, it starts with a phrase, "After this, the word of the Lord came to Abram in a vision." And that is one of those language markers that we're hearing from a different voice, a different stream at this point. the word of the Lord came to X in a vision is sort of the formulaic thing that you read about in Isaiah and in Jeremiah and in a lot of the works of the prophets. That's often how they receive message from God, is in a vision, and often the sort of the language formulation around that is that the word of the Lord came to so and so, and so that is more something that happens in the prophetic books, but not so much in the storytelling nature.
Moses doesn't get a vision, does he? He gets a burning bush.
Well, and so that's one way to think about it, is if you think about some of the previous times that God speaks to Abram, they tend to be a little more anthropomorphic in how God takes him outside and shows him the stars, or he doesn't necessarily, it's not all done in a vision. God shows up in the midst of whatever is going on and encounters Abraham. So again, not necessarily essential to understand that, to understand what's going on, but it does help to kind of see how that's changing. And one of the other things that you'll notice is in the past, when God has renewed or affirmed the covenant, it's been fairly brief and more vague. I mean, again, the stars in the sky or the grains of sand metaphors, it's been rough like that. In chapter 15, we get a very detailed account, well, of two things, of the process of covenant that takes place, the ceremony around it, and then God lays out a much more specifics about what the promise is. It's also, chapter 15 is also the first time in these encounters that we have Abram speaking to God. Usually he's just the recipient of whatever the announcement is. So what is the first thing that Abram says to God?
Give him a son.
No, that Abram says to God.
Oh, sorry.
Yeah.
You give me no children.
Yeah.
My husband would be my heir.
Yeah. He complains.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Which, I mean, we see in some of the other patriarchs, Moses does his fair share of complaining. And if we think back to the very beginning of Genesis, Adam and Eve had a really interesting relationship with God. It was not a sort of humbleness or an intimidation. I mean, they kind of hid from God, but they also spoke up about stuff they didn't like. So Abram protests, and God says, I'm sorry, I jumped the gun a little bit. This is where he takes him out and shows him the stars in the sky. He gives him a sign, and Abraham accepts that on faith.
He says, sometimes it says no children, sometimes it says no son.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
But it's always that Sarai is barren, so presumably no daughters.
Yeah.
They don't get much of a mention in any case. But
Yes.
do they just take children to mean sons at this stage?
Well, I mean, it could be, or it could just be reinforcing the barrenness issue in general, just that continues to be the obstacle to, that would be the obstacle that we would expect Abram to trip up on in his faithfulness to God. That Abram has repeatedly done what, I mean, we talked a week or two ago about the distances that they traveled after being called by God. He's done that. They've gone down into Egypt and had the whole episode in Egypt, escaping famine. He's fought this war with these 9 kings. All of this stuff has happened, and yet still no offspring, which is the key to the promise. And so I think that's the tension that Bruggeman was kind of speaking to that I read earlier, is Abram probably, well, we don't know. Does he feel like he's kind of being strung along and like never gets his part of the deal? I mean, that would be, and that's kind of what he's complaining about here at the beginning of 15 is, you keep telling me this is going to happen. I'm not getting any younger, and
Do you think he shared this promise with the rest of his family? He told them exactly what God had promised him, rather than just promising God's going to lead us to a nice place to live.
Yeah, I don't know. I don't know.
I mean, the next one, Sarah just laughs at it.
Yes, yeah.
Maybe is that the first time she'd heard about it? That this was part of the deal.
Yeah, well, or could be, or could, well, I mean, we'll see when we get to the next chapter. I mean, she's concerned that he has no children. So whether that's just a natural concern because of the nature of how people lived back then, that, you relied on children, probably more male children, than female children because of the way the society was structured. But
you still die before you could get killed in battle.
Well, that's right. But I mean, there was value in having children. So was she concerned because they didn't have any, or was she concerned because she thought she knew what was supposed to happen? But before we get to that, a little bit about, in the middle of chapter 15, there's this ceremony. Abram gets this collection of animals and cloves them down the middle, cuts them in two, arrange their halves opposite each other. This would have been something that was somewhat common at that time as a symbol of covenant or truce between perhaps kings or family leaders or whatever. And the idea was you laid out these animals, cut in half on either side, and each of the parties would step between them. And the idea was, if you break this covenant, this is how you're going to wind up. Yeah. So, so that's a little bit of, obviously it sounds very strange and mysterious, as we read it today, but that would have been what the idea was, that they were using a somewhat common practice.
The idea of a tally stick.
Yeah.
Where you make marks on a bit of wood and split it in half on each of your kept it.
Yeah.
Or half
Yeah.
a sixpence.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
It's kind of like,
So that's what's going on in that little bit. The other thing to kind of notice as we go forward is there's going to be 2 or 3 times in this section where God presents the covenant, presents the terms of the covenant, and they get more and more specific and more more and more involved in ways. Let's see. Okay, yeah, we'll get to that in a minute. But first, so we get to chapter 16, and we get the issue with Sarai essentially offering her slave girl to be a surrogate for Abram to have children. That was not an unknown thing at the time, again, because of the importance, I think, of having children. So in and of itself, that would not have been considered especially scandalous behavior.
But it would have been if it had been the other way around.
Yes, yes.
Absolutely.
You never
Yes.
get the good side.
You never
You always get the problem.
But
Nothing changes.
yeah,
True. Did you hear what he said?
Yeah.
You get a fallen woman, but you never get a fallen man.
well, wait till we get to Lot. We'll talk about that. So Abram sleeps with Hagar, and she becomes pregnant, and immediately Sarah is jealous and angry about it, and takes it out on Abram.
But she said it in the first, put him up to it in the first place.
Well,
Or did she think he was his fault that she wasn't having children?
I don't know.
Checking him out.
Testing him.
Yeah.
So we have a section there where it's the argument between Abraham and Sarah, and she yells at him, and he says, "It was your idea," and so probably to get out of it, he's like, "Do whatever you want." And so they kick Hagar out, and she goes out into the desert, and so it's interesting. Our translation says the angel of the Lord found Hagar. Some of the translations just talk about that she's visited by a messenger. But in any event, it's really the first time there's been what commonly would be called like an angel that visits, serving. I mean, their purpose is to be a messenger of God. That's normally the context in which they appear. But this would be the first time we've seen that. The angel of the Lord sort of gives her a prophecy about she'll have a son, she'll name him Ishmael. Maybe not the best.
Is it really?
No, it's not a real exciting. Probably not the prophecy most pregnant mothers would hope for. But what's interesting is so there's a couple interesting things. If you look in verse 13, she gave this name to the Lord who spoke to her. So a couple of the commentaries have talked about, well, was it an angel or a messenger, or was this God that came and talked to her? Maybe it doesn't matter if the angel is an emissary of God. It doesn't really matter who it is, but she addresses God and says, it's kind of a weird translation here because it says she gave this name to the Lord who spoke to her. In the manuscript, in other translations, there is actually another one of the names for God, El Oroi, I think. Oh, it does say down there, a little further down. That's they named the well Lahai Roy. So it's El Roy is the name that she gives to God, because that is the God who sees her, and she has seen the one who sees me. So it's just a little interesting that she takes comfort in the fact that someone, I guess, has taken interest in her, and she's not perhaps an object, a possession of someone else, but she is her own person. So that'll come up later too when they get kicked out again. So Hagar gives birth. Ishmael is the son. Abram was 86 at the time.
But she gets the name when she's at the well,
Uh-huh.
and it says Abraham gave the name Ishmael to the son. So
Yeah,
you can imagine some conversations going on there.
yeah, I would imagine. Yeah, there's probably some stuff in the background we're not privy to at this point, but yeah. Right, so then chapter 17. So the first thing to notice is we've skipped over 13 years very quickly, which I think, again, I hadn't made much note of until thinking about the concept of the tension in which the promise and the realization, continue to be separated. So however long it's been since he uprooted all of his family and took off out of Haran to go out to the land of Canaan, however long all of that's been, now there's another 13 years on top of that. And I guess when you're 99, maybe the 13 years isn't that big a deal, but it is an extended period of time. And then, so God appears again to Abram. I will make my covenant between me and you and will greatly increase your numbers. So again, there's the promise of progeny. This time, Abram doesn't really argue. He's laying face down, and God has a quite extended set of instructions that most notably include the sign of circumcision. Before we get to that, though, let me back up. He does at this point change Abram's name to Abraham. That's in verse 5. Abram means exalted father, and Abraham means, father of a multitude. So they're variations on the name father. Sarai and Sarah are both variations of the word for princess. So part of the suggestion here is Abram is getting a new name in the way that a king might take a new name when they assumed power.
when a baby gets a name.
Well, or when, yeah. Yeah, but more a sign that this is the full burden of the covenant that is now being laid upon Abraham, and so he gets a promotion, I suppose, in the midst of it. So the covenant, then, again, there's the promise of offspring and land. There are specific pieces of land that are designated once again. And then God says, so you must keep my covenant. This is down in verse 9. And this is my covenant with you and your descendants after you, the covenant you are to keep. Every male among you shall be circumcised. So another layer of sort of obligation to remain in covenant, but it still doesn't seem to address the issue of children. It does include the promise in verses 15 and 16. It talks about that Sarah will be the mother of nations. Kings of people will come from her. And that's kind of the first time specifically she has been part of the promise. That the promise has always been that Abraham will have all this offspring. And it's sort of insinuated that it'll come from Sarah, but it's not been explicit. So, which probably then, the next little bit, Abraham fell face down, he laughed, and said to himself, will a son be born to a man 100 years old? Will Sarah bear a child at the age of 90? And Abraham said to God, if only Ishmael might live under your blessing. So, I have a feeling part of it is, why don't we just take Ishmael and let's just,
That's it.
and let's just, all this other stuff, let's just say Ishmael is it. And then I don't have to worry about all this. And, I mean, obviously, he's laughing at the idea that Sarah's going to become pregnant. So would we. Yeah. And so, you kind of wonder if part of it is just some exasperation at, oh my God, how long is this going to go on? 13 years ago, you told me I was going to have all these kids. Well, longer ago than that, so I think that's part of it is he's like, I've already got a son, so why don't we
Leave it at that.
Yeah. Why don't we do things through him?
And where does the idea of circumcision suddenly spring from? I mean, I can imagine
It's
people
so
going and
hard,
saying,
isn't it?
oh, that's a good idea, let's go
Was that practice locally as a fertility right?
It's related. There were certain. There were other cultures at the time that would have practiced circumcision. Generally, though, it was a rite of fertility, and it was usually practiced as like a rite of passage at puberty. Yeah. Yes. Yeah. Yeah.
I did in the Jewish faith.
So, so it would not have been unheard of. It would not have been an expectation necessarily on Abraham or his household, or
You want to say what you're talking about.
Yeah. I don't think I signed up for that. Well, and so God's already given the command about circumcision and all the males in his household and all that. And it's the thing that Abraham responds to is the notion that Sarah will be pregnant. So either that didn't shock him or worry him, or just the whole idea around Sarah, kind of put that part out of your mind. This is really what he's responding to. So then again, detailed description. Sarah will be pregnant. You'll call your son Isaac. And very definitely, God will establish the covenant with him as an everlasting covenant for his descendants after him. As for Ishmael, I hear you. I'll make him fruitful and make him into a great nation. So Ishmael gets something out of the deal.
It says here that Isaac means he laughs, which seems a bit out of context with the other names they're giving him.
Well, and part of that though is Abraham laughs here, and what does Sarah do? She laughs. So it's kind of a play on that idea that that she laughs. So Abraham spends the rest of the day circumcising everybody in his household. And himself, yeah.
Ishmael specifically mentioned it.
Huh?
Even Ishmael specifically mentioned even at that point.
Yes, yeah. Yeah, so that was probably an exciting afternoon.
All who set themselves down.
Yeah.
It's been a good time for the enemies all to attack, wasn't it?
Yeah.
That's one thing that all Jewish people still do, don't they? I
Mhm.
mean, they may not all agree on other parts of, but that is a sort of given now, isn't it? Am I right?
I think so. Yeah.
As a baby.
Strange, isn't it?
Yeah.
Yeah.
As a baby.
And the timing of it, too.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yes.
When they're 8 days old.
Yes.
Still.
And
Yes.
my parents had my brother circumcised. I don't know why. I think it must have been a thing.
It wasn't like 8 days, was it?
Yeah.
Was it? Oh,
I don't know, I wasn't there.
But there's something about the timing of it, too.
Well, I mean, I don't remember now the percentages. I mean, I remember reading before, at least in the States, I mean, there was a fairly decent percentage, not, I mean, across the board, not just among people of the Jewish faith, that it was,
Yeah.
I think it's decreasing, but I think it,
So it's to give them, so the doctors get plenty of money.
well,
It's not the doctor that does it.
Because that would have been
Jewish babies, is it?
well, no, they have a,
Is it
yeah.
done on the national health thing?
Only if you've got medical.
Yeah.
Must be lots of reasons for it, not just.
Well, I think,
It's religious.
I mean, I think there are health reasons for it. And not that maybe is why or why not it's,
Jewish women do very rarely get cervical cancer because the men are circumcised. There you go.
no,
Who works in that field.
yeah.
So there, there are hygiene, health reasons.
Yeah. So, I mean, that may or may not have been what drove the practice thousands of years ago. But I mean, I think that's part of what contributes to people still,
Yeah,
In the
Using
same
them.
way as the food regulations.
yeah.
Hygiene
yeah.
basis.
Yeah, one other note on that before we go to chapter 18 was just one of the things in one of the commentaries talked about the symbolism of the covenant sealed on the organ of procreation may connect circumcision with fertility. That it was, I don't know that it would necessarily, affect the percentages of that, but that was the symbolism of it specifically. So I mentioned at the beginning, when we got to chapter 15, the voice had kind of changed, and we were into much more, a lot more specifics about what the covenant was. Obviously, this last chapter is mostly God laying out all these different aspects of the covenant. When we get to chapter 18, we sort of revert back to the Yahwistic storytelling again, and you can kind of feel it in the way that this interaction is described. It's reads more like sort of like a novel as opposed to
Instructions.
yeah. So there's some interesting stuff going on here. God appears to Abraham. Abraham sees three people. It doesn't necessarily appear that Abraham knows that that's God. So it's just interesting. The other times that God appears to Abraham, God appears to Abraham. But this time it's sort of incognito in a way.
It's very specific about the place and what time of day and
Yeah.
is it a miracle?
Why does he immediately bow down on the ground in front of them? What's special about these men that he sees who he doesn't know?
Yeah. Well,
Thinks there's God's messengers again, maybe?
it could be.
Another sort of vision, he could see them, he could see through them as well. It was like
Yeah, and maybe he does. It's hard to tell for sure what exactly. I mean, he certainly doesn't treat them like God. I mean, this interaction is very different than the ones we've seen before. He, certainly the
well, if they
humbling
suddenly
and bowing
appeared,
down.
He didn't see them walking towards it, they suddenly appeared.
Well,
There was something
yeah.
special.
Yeah. Now, I mean, the hospitality bit with feeding them and offering them water and cleaning their feet and giving them a place to rest, that probably was not wholly out of sort of that, he probably too early to call it Jewish or Hebrew hospitality, but, you'll see a lot of the emphasis on the importance of that in the early books of the Old Testament, talking about, the way that you treat other people and visitors and all that sort of thing. So that hospitality bit may or may not have really been anything unusual if someone showed up at your tent. And so it's just interesting, the language here. Where's your wife Sarah? They asked him. There in the tent, he said, this is verse 9. Then one of them said, I will surely return to you about this time next year, and Sarah, your wife, will have a son. So I just think it's interesting that they asked the first one, and then very specifically one. I don't know that it means anything, but it's just something that kind of stood out as I was looking through it. And so it says Sarah laughed to herself and then thought, is this possible? And then very clearly in verse 13, it's God talking to Abraham. Why did Sarah laugh and say, was he suddenly revealed? I don't know. Why did Sarah laugh and say, well, I really have a child now that I am old? Is anything too hard for the Lord? I will return to you at the appointed time next year, and Sarah will have a son. So Sarah says, I didn't laugh. And God said, yes, you did laugh. Which, I mean, right there gives you the little storytelling, flavor of it. Yeah.
Yes, you did.
Yeah. So, yeah, a little panto language in there. Oh, yes, you did. Yeah, so just very interesting. And you do, it. So did Abraham know this was God? Maybe. Hard to say. He gets this promise again. Now there's a specific date on it.
You read their food first, and then this is after,
Yeah.
after they took under a fig tree.
Yeah.
Yes, there's a fig tree, and there's some other named tree before it. Suddenly it goes from these sort of general conceptions to all these
Tiny
specifics.
details.
Yeah. Yeah.
I'm sure the scholars have looked into all that.
Just little throwaway lines.
Yeah.
We didn't say anything, but when they had the sacrifices, there's a bit about the birds of prey coming down. What's the relevance of that?
Oh yeah. He chased the birds of prey off. Yeah. And I, in a couple of the.
Because he didn't want it to, the idea was he had to leave those dissected.
Well, he didn't want
animals,
them.
didn't want the birds to take.
Yes.
Because if the birds had taken one, how was he going to explain it was missing?
Well, and there was some couple of the commentaries spent some time on that, and one of them said, well, there's really, you could say, oh, well, the birds of prey were sort of playing the role of like the serpent in the garden, that it was this, whether or not it was an evil presence, it was this other, something working against God's intent. And then the other commentary said, you're probably reading too much into it if it's, so.
Like a throwaway line.
Yeah. Or maybe it makes it more realistic. You chop up all these animals and lay them out, they're going to attract attention. Yeah. I mean, it's just, some of it is just certainly with the age of these stories and the ways that they're collated, and then the ways that we can tell they've been, sort of moved around and edited. I mean, when we get to this story, when we get to chapter 18, chapter trying to look here, see if it says in chapter 16. Well, at the end of chapter 16, it tells how old Abram was when Ishmael was born. At the beginning of chapter 17, it talks about, you can easily deduce there have been these 13 years that have passed in between. Chapter 18, that story, it doesn't talk about Ishmael. It doesn't talk about, obviously, the rest of the story, Isaac comes after Ishmael. But yeah, there's no, it doesn't really tie it to a specific time. Was this immediately following the events of chapter 17 that this happened?
When the Ishmaelites going to become another enemy later on.
They will, yeah. But it kind of changes.
If this started off as an oral tradition before the writing was even invented, or whatever, you can imagine someone telling these rather humorous bits, just like you tell a joke and you add your own little bit to it.
Yeah.
So even if someone had heard it before, they hadn't heard that bit.
Yeah. Well, I suspect there's, again, so you have that whole process of collecting oral traditions that, the story your family tells is going to be different than the story your family tells, slightly, and so, if you're collecting this tradition and you got, well, the main story is this, but then I heard this and I heard this, how do you kind of collect those? And then, I think I mentioned before, any translation is interpretation. So even if your emphasis is, I want to translate this literally from, the oldest manuscript I can find, there are times when you have to make interpretive decisions about what the text says or means. And so all that, can sometimes muddy the picture in a way. But, at the same time, obviously at some point this was copied down and became more standardized, and
which is why the scrolls are so renovated, isn't it? Because it's unchanging
well,
from them.
yes,
Unchanging
yeah,
words at all.
yeah. So, the challenge comes, when you discover the cave in Qumran with the Dead Sea Scrolls,
Yeah.
and they say something slightly different, and they're older than the oldest manuscript that we have. So then, how do you? Yeah. So it's a constant process. Somebody can make a discovery today of some ancient manuscripts someplace that could. An easy place to see it is at the end of Mark's Gospel, because there's like 3 different endings to Mark's Gospel.
Yeah.
And well, anyway, there's a note. I assume there's a note in the NIV. I know there's one in the NRSV that is a long note that explains why some think it stops here, some think it stops here, some think this part was added, and that's part of that process. That when probably like when for example, the King James translation took place, they were basing it on on manuscripts they had. And that's 500 years ago. So now we know we found other versions of Mark's Gospel that's basically the same thing, except it ends differently. So how do you make sense of
The
that?
earliest Old Testament texts are going to be after the Babylonian exile. They didn't have written text before that.
That's a good question. I think the oldest text in the Old Testament is the book of Job that they've found. That's the oldest existent manuscript.
How does that fit in with that's after the exile?
I'd have to go back and look.
During the time of the king, they ascribe things to Solomon and David.
Yeah. I'd have to go back and look and see, but yeah, that may be.
At some point, this became more, once it was written down, it became
Yeah.
bureaucratic in a way. This is what we're going to use.
Yeah.
Sort of.
I'll make a note.
I wish somebody would sort out this business of the number of years. There must be something that made them think this was the end of a year. Was it the end of a season?
Yeah.
There's 4 seasons in a
seasons
year.
doesn't work, does
Would
it?
that make a bit more sense if they?
But they also use months, don't they? So they know that months are shorter than years.
Yeah.
That's and then, even if you can't judge from the sun, that's quite difficult, particularly if you're in a hot place. But the moon coming and going,
Yeah.
and also it fits with menstruation, all those sorts of things. They must have been aware of that.
Even if you break it into seasons, though, 1,000 years old, it's still 250, so that's not right.
And at some point, well, no,
It's
even
amazing that all of the researches that have gone on,
Yeah.
nobody's ever been able to sort that out.
even Moses has to live a large number of years because he's got to spend 40 of them.
Yeah, but if
Yeah.
those
Last
40
40
years were like 10 years.
Yes,
Yeah.
That's what I'm saying.
Right,
It's
Yeah.
like
more
40,
sense with
if
it,
was-
yeah.
Yeah.
You know,
If they start using these allegorical numbers like 40, which just means, and then you've got someone who lives through it all,
yeah.
Yeah.
And was obviously called earlier, you've got to adjust, it's better to adjust the human years, so the human numbers rather than the ones that are
Yeah.
ordained by God.
Yeah.
I mean, King David and Solomon, they sort of had normal sort of lifetimes, didn't they? They got it sorted out by then.
Well, that's it.
Yeah, yeah. Well, and you move into a period though where there's also historical corroboration
Yeah.
at times. You know, I mean, there are certain not in this period that we're studying, but
No.
you know, as you get to like David and things, there are certain references to things in the scripture that we know historically happened at a certain date or within a certain.
Yeah, I mean, I read on Sunday, read from Lamentations in the introduction to it, it says the exile, the
Yeah.
sacking of Jerusalem was.
Yeah,
something
know when the
like
exile
500
is, yeah.
BC.
Yeah.
No, that accurate.
Yeah. By the time, you get to those, around the time of the exile, and it becomes, because you have some of the other neighboring societies who are very good at historical.
And they're into
Records.
astronomy and all that sort of thing, whereas the Jews don't seem to worry about it.
Yeah, not as big of a change. Well, that was a lot. So take a week off, and we'll come back and look at the rest of chapter 18 on through chapter 22 in 2 weeks' time. I walked up.
Inclusive of 22.
Yes.
Yeah, inclusive.
Yes. I walked off this morning and left my speaker and my tablet at home, so I'll just hold the music until our next gathering. But
Will you post it online with the online version?
I could.
Yeah, anyway. No, but you give a link to it. don't
Yeah.
you?
All right, I'll do that. Go online later, check it out. Fair enough. It's interesting. It's a song called "Tango with God." It's not specifically about Abraham, but it's I think picks up some of the tension that we talked about.
Circumcision, did you?
No. Not much of that on Spotify. So.
I'm sure there is on the dark
Well,
website. If you look hard enough, you know where to look.
Well, thank you all.